Everyone knows that funk is all about making you move. And it's true that without the right rhythmic attitude, your music isn't going to sound like funk, no matter what. But it's also true that it's not quite all there is to it. There are lots of harmonic and melodic tropes that funk and soul music use and have used since their inception, which help define just what makes something sound funky. And to be honest, these tropes haven't changed much since the birth of funk music, with bands like Wolfpack and the Motet proving that the sound can be just as relevant today as it was 40 years ago. Now, patron Chris Bloom requested that I take a look at the Pilotwings 64 soundtrack, which is a perfect excuse for me to talk about common techniques of writing funk music because the soundtrack is crammed full of them. Pilotwings 64's music is clearly inspired by old school funk, soul, and pop music, and so I want to show you some examples of classic tunes in these genres alongside the examples from the game, to show you how they could have influenced the game's soundtrack. Let's start with the most common harmonic convention in funk music, the static dominant chord. Why worry about a bunch of chords passing by when you've already got enough on your plate worrying about that groove? That groove, baby! Just pick a chord and sit on it. This technique goes all the way back to James Brown.
Stay on the scene, get on up like a sex machine, get on up.
The static chord will more often than not be a dominant chord, and this is probably due to the influence of the blues on the funk genre as a whole. This is effective because dominant chords are inherently a little bit unstable, keeping the music from getting stale even without a changing chord progression. And they more readily accept tension, allowing musicians to throw in dissonances when soloing or jamming, creating a flow of tension and release even while staying on one chord. Check out how the Choose Character theme alternates between a G9 voicing and a G11 voicing, featuring this dissonant half-note rub between the 3rd and the 11th to create an arc of tension and release without ever changing the actual chord. Another similar common move is to jump to the dominant 4 chord at a new section and sit on that for a bit. This is guaranteed to raise the greasy funkometer on your tune if you're in a pinch. While we're on the subject of dominant chords, funk and soul music absolutely loves secondary dominants. I'm sure I've covered this before, but basically a secondary dominant takes a chord in a progression and gives it its own personal 5 chord, introducing some out-of-key notes, but in a way that resolves cleanly, giving the chord progression some intrigue without sounding too chaotic. One great example is Sly and the Family Stone's If You Want Me to Stay.
If you want me to stay, I'll be around today to be available for you to see. I'm about to go.
If you're familiar with the Pilotwings soundtrack already, you might have recognized this as being almost the exact same chord progression of the fan favorite Birdman tune. It's a simple enough progression to write. You just start on the tonic, secondary dominant your way to another chord, usually a minor chord if you're in a major key or vice versa, and then 5 your way back to 1. The composer of the soundtrack, Dan Hess, said in a 2013 interview that the game's director asked him to write music that was, quote-unquote, floaty fluffy. And so the soundtrack mixes funk elements with more pop songwriting techniques to achieve this. A common one is the flat 7-4-1 chord progression, also referred to as a double plagal cadence, which was popularized first by the Beatles and then soon after by, well, basically everybody else. The idea is really similar to using secondary dominants, only instead of using a target chord's 5 chord, you use its 4 chord to make a secondary plagal cadence, I guess. Stacking 2 plagal cadences on top of each other like this gives you a 4 of 4 to 4 to 1, or flat 7 4 to 1. You can stack these plagal cadences as far back as you want to go, like in Jimi Hendrix's famous Hey Joe.
Hey Joe, I heard you shot your woman down, you shot her down now.
But this 3 chord progression is much more common, seen in songs like Hey Jude. as well as throughout the Pilotwings soundtrack. It definitely gives the soundtrack a break from the funky jams for something a little bit more chilled out. Now we've talked about a couple harmonic tricks, but what about writing funky melodies? Well, to be frank, a lot of funk isn't too concerned with melody. But there are certain things to keep in mind when making a riff or a melody line if you want it to sound authentic to this genre. These things can basically all be boiled down to one word: pentatonics. Now, the pentatonic scale is kind of ubiquitous throughout, well, all music, in basically all genres across all time, so just saying the word pentatonics isn't actually that helpful. What I mean is that the use of purely pentatonic melodies and riffs paints the music with a specific color, much in the same way that chromatic approach tones can color the sound of a whole melody, as I explained in my last video. There's two ways that the Pilotwings soundtrack uses the pentatonic scale. Firstly, it uses a 6:1 melodic resolution. I say this is pentatonic because the 6:1 is one of the things that sets the major pentatonic scale apart from every other kind of scale. This melodic resolution, often preceded with the fifth, is found all over old soul and pop music. It's actually a very distinctive sound. Check out how it's used in the Four Tops' I Can't Help Myself. We also see the same idea used in the bass line to the Jungle Hopper theme. Really, that's the sound I'm talking about here. The other pentatonic sound we find in the soundtrack is the minor pentatonic scale used over a dominant chord. The most obvious example would probably be the Rocket Belt theme, which starts with this big fat D minor pentatonic line before diving into a jam on a D7 chord. Or check out the bass line to the Select Mission theme, which leans heavily on the minor pentatonic scale even while the harmony clearly uses the major third over top of it. And since we're on the subject, I have to take a moment before we go to talk about bass lines. In any given funk tune, the bass line is almost more of a melody than the actual melody. Across the whole soundtrack to this game, the bass line is front and center, sitting high in the mix with a catchy, syncopated line that you're just as likely to get stuck in your head as each tune's actual melody. With the exception of Jungle Hopper, of course. I don't think I'll ever be able to get that melody out of my head. Ever. Check out these bass lines, and as you listen, focus on three things: how much motion and range there is, how many chromatic and bluesy embellishments they use, and how often they emphasize the offbeat 16th notes rather than the strong beats so typically emphasized by bass lines in other genres. If you're trying to write funky music, having a strong and interesting bass line like this is key. Well, there you have it. Whether it's the chord progressions, or the melodies, or the tasty bass lines, I hope I could shed some light on what makes funk sound funky, and what makes Pilotwings 64 sound funky as well. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, etc., feel free to tweet me at 8-Bit Music Theory. If you'd like to support this channel, you can check out my Patreon page here. Thanks again to Chris Bloom for the request, and I'll see you guys all in the next one.